I'm Annie Duke, and in this lesson, we're going to look at the most troublesome hand in poker, Ace King. Why is Ace King so hard to play? Well, because it's certainly a premium hand, but it's not really a premium hand that's quite all it's cracked up to be because it's very vulnerable to the flop. So stick around and let me show you how you can keep your chip stack from sliding across the table when you're holding Big Slick. The reason so many players go broke with Ace King is because they really just don't understand how much its value changes depending on what the flop is. We're going to make sure you don't suffer from that same problem. So first, let's look at the hand when you completely miss the flop. You don't hit anything, you don't hit a pair. In this case, you're just holding air. I mean, granted, it's big air, it's the best air you can have, but the fact is that you still don't have anything but overcards to the board. You're just holding ace high. Since your hand isn't really all that strong, you want to play it a little carefully. If you're in position and you were the pre-flop raiser and your opponent checks to you, you can now make a continuation bet that's about 50 to 60% of the pot. That means you only really have to win the hand about 40% of the time to be really profitable. If your opponent bets into you when you were the pre-flop raiser, you can keep the pot small by calling and floating him to the turn. If he checks, you can bet and take the pot. If he bets again, you can decide on whether or not you want to continue with the hand on the turn. If you weren't the pre-flop raiser and your opponent checks the flop to you, remember, don't bet out with your ace king because the chances are if he decided to check after he raised pre-flop and not continuation bet, he probably caught a pretty big part of that flop and is trying to trap you. Instead, check behind him, and then you can reevaluate the strength of your hand on the turn, depending on whether you improve and hit an ace or a king on the turn, or depending on whether he checks to you. If the pre-flop raiser does continuation bet this hand, then you can float him with your ace king if you want by just flat calling and then trying to take the pot away from him by betting if your opponent checks the turn. Now, if you're out of position with your ace king and you raise before the flop, you can make a standard continuation bet. If you didn't raise before the flop, do not make a weak lead with your hand if you miss. Instead, check call your opponent to float him to the turn, or check raise this hand if you think that he's super weak and he'll fold to the pressure. Remember though, check raising here is a pure bluff and you don't have to do it. You could also choose to just check and fold because you're going to have to make a pot-sized bet in order for your play to look believable. So that's a big risk. Now, if you don't flop air, and you do flop, say, exactly one pair, don't get too carried away with the strength of your hand, because even though you do have the best kicker with either your ace or your king, the fact is that you still only have one pair, which means you really want to exercise pot control unless your hand improves. From position, if your opponent checks to you and you were the pre-flop raiser, you certainly would want a continuation bet. Now, you would want to check your hand if your opponent was the pre-flop raiser and all of a sudden checks to you. Remember, when your opponent raised before the flop and checks, it means he probably has something pretty big. So you only have one pair, so check in position. Don't fall for it. Now, if your opponent was the pre-flop raiser, or if you were the pre-flop raiser and your opponent bets into you, you should really just call. Resist that urge to raise because you want to keep the pot small. Now remember, it's even more important to keep the pot small when you're playing just a single pair from out of position. But what if you flop something better, like two pair or a straight? Flopping two pair with ace king is really only slightly worse than flopping a set. It's in fact second best to a set. So you should play the hand like you had a set depending on your position and whether or not you were the pre-flop raiser. So you can refer back to the previous lessons on flopping sets and straights if you need reminders on how to play these really big hands. Remember, the key to successfully playing ace king is to determine exactly how strong your hand really is after the flop. Don't get married to your hand just because you're holding big cards. Instead, determine if your hand is a bluff or if it's just one pair or if it's something bigger, and then play the hand accordingly.